Hey there everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, and you're looking at my old high school as it stands today. And the football field, and the softball fields, other fields in the distance. And this is not a video about nostalgia, not by any means. I'm just starting here, because this is still here. This was a lot thinner when I was a kid, but there's this little path that you can exit the school property from, and you just climb up between these properties here. And honestly, like literally, you had maybe about 2 feet between brush on each side. So this is actually kind of nice. But this is kind of cool and old. But if you keep climbing this rugged path and you get to the top, you come out here, right at the intersection of Oatfield and McNary Road, going up there. So why am I here, just above the hill of my high school, near specifically McNary Road? Well, I don't know exactly where it is. I haven't found any old maps. I just know that a lot of the roads are named after families that lived in this area. And there was a place known as McNary Farm that had to have been in this vicinity. It may have been right up over here, right up over here, but it was definitely in this vicinity. So if you know a little bit more about the history of this specific area, maybe you can guide me to where exactly the McNary Farm would have been located, because I'm approximating here. You know, a lot of the roads that are named after families that had farms, I don't know why there's so many big trucks up here. This is just a side street. But yeah, you might be able to point me in the right direction. But I swear, the first time I learned about the case I'm going to bring to you today, I found some resource. This is like 5-6 years ago. I don't remember where it was, what it was, who wrote it, but they said that this instance happened right off of McNary and Oatfield right there. So somewhere up here. And there's some pretty nice houses up here. This is the kind of place where enough people see me walking around with my camera, they're probably gonna come out and talk to me. But somewhere around here was the McNary Farm. I mean, I would think I can't be more than 1/8 of a mile off where I'm at right now. And there was a family. They were known as the Hagger family, I think it was. I saw their name spelled both Hagar. That was how I most often saw it spelled. Other resources spelled it as Hager, which that seems more like a typical way that you'd spell a name like that. So maybe it's spelled Hagar, but people wouldn't think it was spelled that way, so they misspelled it with the E. I'm not dead certain. But they were a family that lived up here. And it's actually interesting, thanks to local Oak Grove historians, there was a woman, I believe her family went by the name of Starkweather, and they lived just a little ways off this direction at, I call it Rothy Road. I know some call it Rothy. I'm not sure which is right. And there was a Rothy or Rothy family that had a farm. But the young woman growing up with her family, she wrote a diary that during 1879 and 1880 specifically about her experiences. And she lived just like 2 or 3 blocks from here, roughly. And she talked about all the families that she knew. And a lot of the families that she knew, because this is, it's the 1870s, so it's like this area is still being settled. So pretty much everybody she knew has a street in this area named after him. There's references to, again, the Rothies or the Rothies, the Nath or Neff families. There's lots of references to the Oatfield family, references to the Meldrum family. Pretty much any family she mentioned, they have a street named after them. Strangely enough, I don't think their name, Starkweather, I don't know, is there a Starkweather Street around here? I don't know. Maybe there is. And in her piece, they would discuss visiting the Hagger family. And there was even one passage in there where she mentions the fact that the mother of the household, a Barbara Hagar, who was 55 years old in 1979, had been brutally butchered in her home. Just a bizarre and just twisted murder case that's generally kind of forgotten because it happened outside of Portland. In fact, pretty much anybody who writes about it implies that this happened in Oregon City. And I don't mean to burst anyone's bubble, but Oregon City, you still got another 2 or 3 miles that way before you get to Oregon City. But I think a lot of stuff that happened more than a couple miles south of Portland, people would just kind of infer it happened in Oregon City. No, Barbara Hagar was not killed in Oregon City. She was killed here, which is kind of generally still considered Milwaukee. We're close to Gladstone, but not Oregon City. So here's what happened in this area right behind me. It is February 21st, 1879, so we're going back. Barbara Hagar was home alone during the afternoon. Her husband had gone to town up into Portland, and by this point they'd had 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. One of their sons and one of their daughters were old enough that they'd moved away from home, but one of their daughters, Mary, was still living at home. But she had also left and traveled down to Oregon City. Didn't return home till around 5 p.m. And when she comes home, she discovers a grisly sight. Again, right up there somewhere in this immediate vicinity. Somebody, while Barbara was home alone, had gone onto the property, likely grabbed a hatchet. It was a hatchet that they used on the farm to cut firewood and things like that. They'd gotten a hold of a hatchet from on their property. This individual or individuals, because later on the inference was made that multiple people may have been involved, entered the home with this hatchet, and someone brutally beat and just hacked Barbara Hagar to death. She had had just massive cuts. Her head had been split open. It had also been almost completely severed from her body. It was a brutal, vicious, violent crime where whoever was responsible saw to it that she died. And it appeared the purpose of the crime was likely, it was a robbery for money, because the whole house had been ransacked and there were bloody handprints found all over the doors, any drawers, closets, anywhere that somebody might be keeping something that might be worth some value. There was bloody handprints all over them. Like, clearly whoever was responsible for the killing also ransacked the home afterwards and came away with about $30 in coins, and I think they came away with a watch. That was about all they came away with. And there was blood everywhere. The daughter fled the scene, obviously in a panic, ran to some nearby neighbors, and law enforcement were called to the scene. And the hatchet in question was actually found outside near the exit door, and it had been washed. The killer had actually washed it before seemingly just discarding it outside. And Barbara, she put up a fight. She put up a violent fight. She may have been at a disadvantage, either attacked by a younger individual or multiple individuals, and she's 55 at this time. But she fought back. There was so much blood splatter from just the violence of the whole thing. And the collar of her attacker's shirt was discovered on the floor. Like she had just like grabbed him and just like ripped his collar off amidst the scuffle. She was not going to go down without a fight. So just a horrible, violent crime. The kind of crime that even nowadays might garner some attention. Someone might make a YouTube video out of it. And it happened right here, somewhere right here in this vicinity. And it was one of those cases that kind of lingered. It seemed like it was one that probably wasn't gonna get solved. There was one guy, Franz Joseph Bruder, who was arrested shortly after the murder and then quickly released. It was deemed he didn't have any connection to it. He had worked for the Hagger family in the past and was reportedly seen near the farm here around noon on that day that Barbara was killed. He denied having been in the area altogether, and there was nothing to really tie the guy to it. So the case, when you're first legitimate suspect, you got to release that quickly. There's some cause for concern. And it wouldn't be until April, a couple months down the line, that the next real viable suspect would come to law enforcement's attention. And all of the information that I was able to find on this case, which isn't a lot because it's an old case, you'll find the occasional written piece about it, and even those aren't, like, there's not a whole lot of detail to them. So I never really found in the information I had exactly what made authorities target these specific people. In fact, one of the people that was targeted they didn't even know his first name. Even like books and stuff that have referenced it later on down the line have only referenced him as Fairchild. There was some guy named Fairchild who had been hanging out with a guy named Frank Bernard. So Bernard and Fairchild they both came under suspicion. And the only thing I could find that really justified law enforcement's attraction to these two particular guys was a third guy in the overall scheme of things, a guy named James King. Now, James King had traveled from Salem up to Portland with Frank Bernard, no mention of Fairchild, in February 1879, the month that Barbara Hagar is killed. So they were in the Portland area at that time. Now, it's important to note here, before continuing with this, that most of this information was provided by this James King, who will come back into discussion in a little bit. So you've got King, you've got Bernard, and you've got Fairchild. And King is kind of the witness. He's the rat in this case, if you will. And he verifies that Bernard in particular, I don't know about Fairchild, he obviously had some suspicions on him or else the police wouldn't have been going after him. But Bernard was in the Portland area till February 24th when he left, crossed the river into Vancouver and traveled up to Seattle, where he would later be apprehended. So he was here at least a couple days after Barbara Hagar is killed. And James King said that during that time he had traveled from the Portland area down to Oregon City to visit, was it his wife? Yeah, his wife, who was living there. And Bernard came with him on this excursion. So we know at some point Bernard and King had traveled through this area, getting from Portland to Oregon City. And then King drops a bit of a bombshell when he just adds to his story that, oh yeah, Bernard admitted to being the killer. He admitted to being involved in that killing. I'm guessing King also mentioned Fairchild's name in that moment so that they would both be sought after, better way to put it. So it's very interesting. I'm wondering why King waits till almost 3 months, or I guess 2 months, after the murder to come forward with this information. Maybe it wasn't until then that Bernard told him, but the implication is that by the 24th, King stayed around, and that's where they parted ways, was on February 24th, and Bernard went north to Seattle, and he was later apprehended in Seattle, so there's no implications that he left that area. So it seems unlikely that Bernard would have told him about this later. So it's kind of implied that King waited like almost 2 months to tell authorities, oh yeah, that murder that you can't seem to solve, I know who did it. I came to town with the guy, and him and this Fairchild dude were the ones responsible. So ultimately both men are apprehended, and they're put on trial a little later in the year. And Bernard, like a lot of people, for some reason, doesn't really do himself a lot of favors. He denies his involvement. He denies. But then he's like, oh, but like, if you need information on it, I can give it to you. Well, why would you not be involved but have information? Could it be that he was trying to turn the tables on King and claim that he did it? Well, that is a possibility, and it is of some interest because, well, Bernard and Fairchild are finally on trial in December of 1879. And the trial goes nowhere. The jury's out for almost a full day. They come back with 11 for conviction, 1 for acquittal. They can't get everybody to line up for the same verdict. So the case is dismissed, and it actually goes up to a higher court, which decides to dismiss them on all charges. And by this time, the initial trial that ended up not even resulting in someone actually going to prison and taking responsibility for this horrid murder, it's already cost the county so much money. It said in papers that it was one of the most expensive trials in the county's history. They invested all this time and all this money, and it got them nowhere. And really, the whole structure that this trial was built on was the statements of James King. James King is the one that said that these guys were involved. So they went with that, and it went nowhere. So you could see authorities, personnel running the county, a lot of people being kind of frustrated and maybe putting some blame on King for all of this. He's the one that led him astray, so to speak, depending on who you speak to. So interestingly enough, after the whole case against Bernard and Fairchild is dismissed, who is abruptly put on trial, convicted, and sent off to prison for the murder but James King? So I guess they decided when he came forward and said that these other guys did it, he was just trying to pass off responsibility to somebody else, when really he was the one that had committed the murder. I don't know. Even back then, a lot of people didn't really believe he did it. Is maybe just, when major murders like this happen, somebody has to go down for it. So the public won't accept that cases like this go unsolved, and when they do, the powers that be get all of the negative publicity. The police get the negative publicity, the investigator, well, I guess those are the police, the people that, the prosecution gets a bad rap. They need to have someone go down for major crimes like this, and there's a reason why in a lot of major crimes, a lot of innocent people have gone away to prison for those crimes. In 1887, James King is paroled, so he does almost 8 years in prison for a crime that I don't know. It's a strange thing. If Bernard and Fairchild weren't guilty, why would he come out and say that they were? Why would he interject himself into that? Because it seems like, I obviously don't know all the details. We're talking about a story that happened over 140 years ago. But I don't understand why a guy who, if he is responsible, and I'm talking about James King in this case, if he is responsible for the murder, It seems no attention is put on him. Nobody's going after this guy. Nobody's looking into this guy. He comes forward himself and throws some other guys under the bus. But why would it even come to that point unless you actually knew that the authorities were looking at you as a possible suspect? And it's like, well, I know it's me, so I gotta make them think it's somebody else. But it seems like he just voluntarily came forward when nobody was looking into him and put the finger on these other guys. So it's strange. And it almost makes me even more suspicious of him that he would voluntarily do that, like he really had something to hide. But guilty or innocent, I don't know why he would come forward like that and even try to mix himself into it. You know, stay on the lam, stay on the run until somebody's after you. Leave the state, move to another part of the country. It's 1879. It's a lot harder to track people down. I don't know. I don't know about James King. Maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. But what's interesting is another wrinkle, and it seems like this is probably the story that most people have accepted in terms of who was actually responsible. It's not verified in any way, shape, or form. I want to make that clear. It has not been verified. But oddly enough, the same year that James King is released, 1887, there's a guy named Richard Marple who is convicted of killing a guy in Lafayette, Oregon, where he lived. It's a good distance south of Portland. I forget if it's closer to Salem or Corvallis, but anyway, from the Portland area, you got to go a little way south to get to Lafayette. And this is kind of an infamous case historically, and I think more because of the inferred kind of paranormal aspects of it than the actual case itself. But as the story goes, Richard Marple had killed this guy named David Corker. A lot of the evidence against him was circumstantial, but it stands to reason that he was likely responsible for that murder. So he goes on trial, is convicted, and, you know, even as they're preparing to execute him for this crime, he's screaming and pleading his innocence and claiming, I didn't murder anyone, but here you are about to murder me for something I didn't do. And his mother, Anna Marple, that a lot of people in town described as a gypsy, she essentially cursed the town and said it would burn down 3 times. Now, as far as I know, a considerable portion of at least the commercial district of Lafayette is burned down twice. I've seen others say that it has actually burned down 3 times since then. So a lot of people are kind of enthralled by that element. And I can tell you that a couple years ago, I went to the historic cemetery, the historic Lafayette Cemetery with my girlfriend and her mom. And it's one of these places that's highly regarded as a haunted place in Oregon. And there's these really this really kind of creepy story about one of the hauntings that happens there. Is there's apparently this woman, this spirit of a woman that will come up behind you and like scratch you down your back if you go there. And people have claimed to have gone there and felt somebody scratch them and then, you know, shown evidence of being scratched afterwards. Maybe that's real. Maybe they just had a friend scratch their back, so it looked like that happened there. But that's one of the big stories about that cemetery. And I want to say that Anna Marple has been kind of mixed in and associated maybe with that. I know that she died few years on later down the road. And I actually don't know, as of this recording, if she was buried at that cemetery, because I don't know why she would be haunting it if she wasn't. So that's kind of a big story, but I feel like it's really stood the test of time because of those more kind of paranormal haunted elements to it. But while Marple is sitting in a cell and awaiting his fate, there's a guy named William Henry Hess who is sharing a cell with him. And Hess decides to be a jailhouse snitch. So everything that you're about to hear about the Hagger murder is based on what Hess says Richard Marple claimed. So it is based on a jailhouse snitch. So, you know, those you always have to kind of take with a grain of salt, but sometimes they're telling the truth. Sometimes guys are dumb enough to admit to other crimes to cellmates, and Richard Marple could have figured he was done for anyway. So what did, you know, if he's going to get executed soon, why bother, you know, holding back? What are they going to do? Convict you and kill you again? And Hess came forward and stated that Richard Marple admitted openly to him that he and another guy were responsible for killing Barbara Hagar. That they did it for money. They'd come under the impression that they'd recently come into a lot of money. And in one of the resources I read, a lot of the money they did have, they actually had in their son had possession of it, and he lived off in Portland, so there wasn't really a whole lot in the house, which explains why the killer only came away with like $30, which, I mean, $30 in 1879 is a considerable stack of cash, but still, it's not like a huge, gargantuan amount of money. So, according to Hess, Richard Marple took complete responsibility for this crime, and Hess even said that Marple showed him a ring that he had taken from Barbara Hagar. I don't know if it's Hagar or Hagar. Now that I'm starting to say the name differently. Honestly, I don't know for certain. Hagar is probably how I would guess it's said. I'm catching myself saying it a little differently from time to time. So that's pretty damaging. The fact that this guy openly admitted to it. He apparently has a memento from the murder. But again, this is based on this guy Hess and the story that he told. So that's all we have to go on. I don't think anybody else saw this ring. I don't know if anybody else heard this confession. And it's interesting because Marple even admitted to killing a woman in Portland back in 1885. And a lot of people have theorized that that may have been Emma Merlotin, who I've done a video about in the past. And she was a French courtesan, essentially a high-priced sex worker, who in November 1885 was killed in her little home in a murder that still to this day is considered unsolved. And among the suspects that came up, Richard Marple is one of the ones that came up based on what William Henry Hess claims Marple told him. So that was really the last considerable suspect that came up in this case was Richard Marple. And he is kind of the one that I think most people, if anybody's going to be close to being the suspect, which of course, you know, when you're talking about somebody who killed someone, you want to get the right person. So I hate to say that, like, this is the most likely suspect, but I think most people think of it, all the people that came up, Richard Marple is probably the most likely. He definitely had no qualms about killing. So maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't, but he seems like a stronger suspect than these other guys that went up on trial. Granted, we don't know a whole lot about these guys, but that is really where the case kind of lingers, is Richard Marple admitted to it. So did he do it? Yeah, probably. But this was definitely a case that I knew I was going to want to cover in a video someday, because again, when I first learned about it, I remembered hearing that it happened near where McNary Road and Oatfield meet. And then I read further and found out that the Hagar family lived on the McNary farm. So it was right up the hill from where I went to high school. So the moment I stumbled onto this story several years ago and kind of saw it real quick and then put it aside, I mean, I knew I wanted to do a video about it, just for the closeness that I had to where this event happened. And I knew it was a murder, but I didn't know the details till I dove in a little bit more. I didn't realize that it was this butchering, this just hatcheting to death kind of murder, the likes that would befall, you know, the Hill family, like a little over 30 years on down the road. So I always knew I was going to want to cover it someday, and it just kind of sat there kind of forgotten for years. And I always assumed it had a full resolution. And I guess, officially you can argue, yes, it does, because you have a guy named James King who was convicted and went off to prison and was later paroled. So by legal standards, arguably the case has been solved, but again, a lot of people don't think King was responsible. And of course, just because somebody is convicted doesn't mean they did the crime. So yeah, it's still a little up in the air. It's still a little mysterious. I still don't know if the actual guilty party has even been named. Maybe it wasn't one of these guys. You have to remember, it's 1879. Even the east side of Portland is very sparsely developed at this point. So that area between Portland and Oregon City, where Milwaukee and Gladstone are, and where the Haggers would have lived, that was even more sparsely populated. There was not, it was just kind of a few neighbors here and there. It wasn't, a desolate wasteland, but there wasn't a lot of people there. Not a lot of potential witnesses, and some random person could have been traveling through there, going from Portland to Oregon City to Portland, wherever. And they could have traveled through there and gone unseen, pretty much. Seized an opportunity and attacked. And that's what happened to Barbara Hagar while she was washing dishes. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. They think she was washing dishes when she was attacked, because there was a bunch of dishes sitting in dishwater, and 2 dishes had been put up on a shelf. So it was like she was in the process of cleaning dishes when the killer stormed into the house, hatchet in hand, and the scuffle ensues. Bloody, horrific scuffle. So I don't know. I don't know if we know exactly who was responsible for this horrific murder, which I guess adds a more creepy, mysterious element to the whole thing. But again, we're talking about human life here. We're talking about being killed in just a horribly violent and painful manner. So I mean, whether it's resolved or not doesn't change that fact. And that is, as far as I've been able to gather, for such an old case, the story of the murder of Barbara Hagar in 1879, right in my backyard, generally kind of the Oak Grove, pseudo-Milwaukee area. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I tried to do the best I could videoing on the scene, but there was a lot of vehicles for some reason going up McNary Road, which is interesting because it's not really a through road. There was also a really sketchy homeless guy that was kind of lingering in the area, because no matter where you go these days, there has to be a homeless person right next to you. There was just a lot of traffic and a lot of stuff going on, so I tried to do the best I could getting video there at the scene. Just really wanted to finally cover this story. So thank you so much for stopping by, taking in the content. And if you're new to the channel or just haven't gotten around to it and you like what I'm doing, subscribe to my channel, give the video a like. You can hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out there. All those different things help me in my ventures. It makes doing what I do a little bit easier. The link to my Patreon is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Facebook, Instagram, Reddit subreddit, and my TikTok. And all of that said, one more time, thank you so much for stopping by, taking in today's video. Until next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.